Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today as we learn together. We are really excited to release this project to the community. My name is Megan Cummings, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Women's Fund of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation. This project consists of 3 research papers meant to build on one another to gain a deeper understanding of the factors that fuel and hinder economic mobility for Black women, as well as identify specific policy recommendations. This series will be released over the next 2 years, 2020, best year ever, really, and 2021, which we all hope is a lot better. And this report today serves as the very first in our series, an examination of Black women and the labor and employment system. We are expecting about 200 people to join us for this webinar this afternoon. So please use the question function to ask questions, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. So a couple of expectations. First, this paper is a deep dive on one complex system, the labor system. It does not address how the other systems contribute to the oppression of Black people. Unfortunately, we could have written many lengthy papers backed by research for any other system, criminal justice, healthcare system, education system, etc. So we are just focusing on one system today. Secondly, this is a difficult and triggering subject. It is hard to be confronted with this information in one lengthy paper. As we were bringing all this information together over the past 6 months, there were some really heavy days where we just sat with this information. We cried with this information. It's a lot to handle. So it's okay to feel sad or uncomfortable or really mad today. And it's important we all learn and understand together. Many of you joining us today will shake your head in disbelief because this is new information to you and it's difficult to hear and process. And many of you on this call listening today will nod your head because the themes are all too familiar to you and you may have experienced them firsthand in your own lives. Finally, clearly, I am not a woman of color. I believe being a good ally means we shouldn't rely on only Black people to teach us about how the system oppresses and discriminates against them, their families, and their ancestors. That doesn't mean this paper was written in a vacuum. Most of our sources for this research are Black scholars. This paper has been vetted heavily by a group of Black community members who provided feedback on the framing and content. That being said, we are all still learning and growing as an anti-racist organization, and we are open to any feedback or criticism you have to offer. I'd like to do some thank yous and acknowledgments today. First, thank you to our Applied Research Manager, Sam Maloney, and our Leadership Council member and retired Miami University professor, Dr. Sally Lloyd. They invested hundreds of hours into this project, and we deeply appreciate their expertise. I'd like to thank the rest of the Women's Fund Research Committee, Leah Efkin-Fox, Sarah Gidneys, Sarah Guasada, and Olivia Ballard, and the whole Women's Fund team for contributing in such meaningful ways. I'd like to thank the nearly dozen community reviewers who assisted in reading, responding, and shaping this project. Your feedback was meaningful and important and has been integrated into our final product. So thank you so much to Dr. Karen Bankston, Janae Bradley, Kamara Douglas, Chris Flores, Trina Jackson, Tina Macon, Jocelyn Okrodudu, Zohar Perla, Denisha Porter, Mary Stagaman, and Barbara Turner. And finally, I'd like to thank so much our funders for this project. The Charlotte R. Schmidlap Fund, Fifth Third Bank trustee, who has provided generous multi-year support of the Women's Fund, which has taken us to new heights. And I'd like to thank both the Cincinnati and Queen City alumni chapters of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and the Delta Gateway Foundation. They are supporting all of the work of the Women's Fund this year, especially the research focusing on Black women's upward mobility. Thank you so much for your support. We couldn't do it without you. As I mentioned, this information is heavy today. In the next 90 minutes, we're going to go through a lot. So before we start digesting it together, I'd like to introduce Maya Bird, who will help us center ourselves in this moment. Take it away, Maya.
Hello, I'm Maya Bird. Thank you all for being here today. So there are two aspects that comes to awareness when we're talking about education and allyship, and there's self-awareness, and then there's systemic awareness. And this paper goes very deeply into systemic awareness around the labor system. And so our feelings and our emotions may be all over the place. We may feel some negative emotions. We may feel some discomfort today. So to start us off, I want us to do just a grounding exercise, a breathing exercise, if you will. So if I want you to stand up straight in your chair, sit up straight, and put both feet on the floor. And we're going to take a minute just to breathe and invite us into the space that we want to learn and to educate ourselves. So find a comfortable posture with both feet on the floor. You can allow your eyes to close or to gaze down at the floor. And bring attention to our feet and the areas of contact that they have with the floor. Feel our shoes. And move on to the thighs and where our body meets the chair. Notice where the tension is in your body. Is it in your back, or in your chest, or in your neck? And allow yourself to breathe and release it. Move your attention to your hands. Are they on your knees, on your chair? Ask yourself to feel and let your body feel where it is. Now open your awareness. Feel your entire body sitting here in this moment on this chair. Where do you feel your breath the most? Is it in your nose, in your chest, maybe the belly? Take a full breath in and then exhale. Again. Feel your shoulders rise up and down with each breath that you take. And prepare yourself. We want to be comfortable with discomfort today. If there are any negative emotions that arise, we want to be able to breathe them in and release them. We want to be able to see them without being defensive and to welcome them in. Every emotion that you feel is a messenger, whether that be anger or fear or confusion. Every feeling is a messenger telling us something, letting us know what we need to know about our bodies and about ourselves. I know for many of us, this past week may have been hard with the judgment surrounding Breonna Taylor, only playing into what we're going to be talking about today. And while we're not talking specifically about that system today, I want to take a minute and just acknowledge that also. So, we're going to start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. That was a wonderful way to start the program today. We really appreciate you sharing your talent with us. So let's get right into it. Our economic system is broken, and if it wasn't clear before COVID, it should be very, very clear right now. It's up to all of us to learn, identify, and advocate for change because economic inequity impacts all of us. Our progress and the economic health of our community, it's all intertwined. The first step to a more equitable world is learning, and that's what we're going to do today. The foundation on which our economy was built was one of pursuing economic advancement on the backs of others, with discriminatory, oppressive policies, and even at the cost of people's freedom. This paper examines the labor trends of Black women in the United States history and identifies the systemic barriers in place that strengthen economic inequity even today. The overarching themes throughout US history, Black women have been restricted to devalued, back-breaking occupations with the lowest pay. And yet, Black women have consistently had higher levels of employment than white women, despite stereotypes to the contrary. Even though Black women work hard to support themselves and their family, too many are constrained to take jobs that prevent them from achieving economic self-sufficiency. Only with widespread, intentional change can we remedy the systemic oppression of Black women in our labor market. Indeed, quote, "It is not Black women's refusal to work, but the lack of jobs that pay them a living wage that prevents them from rising above poverty." This presentation and corresponding paper explores the history of Black women's occupation mobility, or rather immobility, in order to provide a context for understanding the economic status of Black women today. This is followed by analyses of the large gap in wages paid to Black women and how both occupational segregation and discrimination and stereotypes continue to reproduce well into the 21st century, the restrictions of Black women's labor that began in slavery. We conclude with what the Women's Fund does best, policy recommendations that can help alleviate and uplift Black women access to economic self-sufficiency. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sam Maloney, our Applied Research Manager for the Women's Fund, to guide you through our first section of results.
Good afternoon, everyone. One overarching theme is clear across the history of Black women's employment. Black women have been deliberately restricted to undervalued occupations and have consistently been regulated to the most onerous and lowest paying jobs. From slavery onward, Black women worked almost exclusively in farm labor and domestic service, and to a lesser extent in the lowest paid industrial jobs. It was not until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that other occupations were truly open to them. As you will hear in this section, the atrocity of slavery established the history of Black women's employment in the United States, which has been marked by discriminatory, oppressive policies and practices meant to maintain white supremacy. In 1619, the first 20 Africans, including 3 women, were brought to America to be enslaved by white landowners. By 1790, African women were 1/3 of the enslaved. Enslaved Black women were forced to work 12 to 16 hours a day in the fields, planting, harvesting, and driving mule teams. Those women not working in the fields worked in the plantation house as laundresses, maids, cooks, or nurses. They also served as midwives and care providers for both Black and white children. American slavery was a highly gendered institution, as the methods of violence and oppression were often different for Black men and women. Black women were frequently subjected to sexual violence and had to endure an enormous amount of backbreaking labor that fell upon all enslaved African people. Furthermore, women's work was largely confined to the boundaries of the plantation, keeping them within close proximity of their oppressive masters. Most free Black women during this time worked either on farms or as domestics. In the South, the most prestigious occupation for free Black women was a seamstress. In the North, these women commonly worked as farm laborers and washerwomen. While it was rare, free Black women also entered the education profession. When the Civil War began, Black women highlighted the importance of education by organizing schools for soldiers and freed men and women. With the end of the Civil War, Black women were met with the racist and sexist resistance to their freedom. Black people were employed on unequal, repressive terms by former slave owners and were met with cruel, often violent policies that created the Jim Crow South, which was state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation and discrimination to maintain the repressive white supremacist oligarchy. Despite the promises of Reconstruction, Black Americans were largely regulated into sharecropping and domestic work that maintained the hierarchy of the formerly enslaved workforce in the South. This hierarchy subverted the liberating and democratic potential of this new working class. Southern states strengthened the white supremacist structure through laws and policies. This was also accomplished in the northern states through customs and traditions. Black women, especially those with children, were often forced to work for white employers who defrauded them by charging exorbitant amount for supplies and boarding and restricting their movements off of the property. Gender discrimination was also written into the guidelines for the Freedmen's Bureau, mandating that Black women and Black men receive unequal compensation because of gender, regardless of work, ability, or productivity. Agents also gave less land to families with women who were head of household. Despite the restrictions and active discrimination, Black women maintained a large presence in the American economy. Black women were more than 3 times as likely to be in the labor force as white women. In 1890, 40% of all Black women worked outside of the home, as compared to 12.5% of white women. Of those Black women in the workforce, 52% worked as domestic servants, 44% in farm labor, and only 4% of working Black women worked in non-farm, non-service jobs, compared to the 52% of working white women. As the 20th century began, Black women were still largely regulated to working as farm laborers or domestic servants. Black women were excluded from the sales and clerical positions that were opening up to white women. Limited opportunities for Black female entrepreneurship slowly began to emerge during this time period. Black women developed businesses such as caterers, dressmakers, funeral directors, and store operators. However, Black female entrepreneurs still face many obstacles, especially in securing capital and loans. At the start of the First World War, although the majority still worked as domestic and farm labor, some Black women shifted into factory work because the men were away at war. Here they were regulated to the most hazardous and undesirable jobs, working in segregated spaces where they were paid extraordinarily low wages. After the war, Black women were forced out of many of their industrial jobs, returning in large numbers to domestic service. Many Black families participated in the Great Migration, with approximately 500,000 African Americans resettling in the northern cities by the end of summer of 1919. All through this migration brought increased economic stability to most Black families. It was met with resistance and hostility by white immigrants and returning service members who were competing for the same jobs. New industrial opportunities in factories were largely available only to men. However, due to the seasonal nature of many of these industrial jobs, Black women became the sole consistent wage earner for their families. Black women in the North primarily supported themselves and their families through domestic personal service, work taking in laundry and sewing, and to a more limited extent, running beauty salons, bars, and other small businesses. During the Great Depression, every group of Americans was impacted, but no group was hit harder than Black families. By 1932, about half of Black Americans were out of work. That was twice the rate of white Americans. When recovery efforts began, Black Americans were largely discriminated against in the New Deal, including in job and housing initiatives. Black families were particularly harmed by the Social Security Act of 1935, as the provision for aid to families with dependent children was meant to support the welfare of poor mothers who stayed at home with children. The law excluded domestic and agricultural workers from receiving the benefits, thus directly excluding Black working women. Until the 1960s, poor Black women could not receive cash assistance because they, the white public officials, expected Black women to be employed moms and not stay-at-home moms like white women. In fact, many policymakers refused to support New Deal legislation that included protections for Black workers, and the New Deal largely favored job creation in male-dominated fields. Black women were forced to turn to other means to find work, and they were actively pitted against each other and against Black men. During the Second World War, many women were working outside the home to help the war effort in jobs formerly held by men. However, Black women were universally recognized as laborers of the last resort and were last hired and first to be let go. Once again, after the war, Black women were forced back out of the factories and into domestic service. At the same time, Black Americans began organizing unions, which allowed them to receive better conditions and salaries. Still, as the American economy began to boom, the increase of mass production manufacturing had a disproportionately high impact on Black workers losing their jobs, as they occupied the lowest skilled positions that were more likely to be mechanized. Further, as white families moved to the suburbs from the urban core, new jobs moved with them. Working Black families were unable to take advantage of these jobs without adequate private or public transportation, and because they were prohibited from living in the suburbs by racial discrimination and practice. While white Americans boomed, many Black Americans faced increased unemployment and poverty. Professional occupations remained largely unavailable to Black women in the first half of the 20th century. In 1930, less than 5% of working Black women were professionals, managers, or working in clerical or sales positions. By 1960, this had only risen to 18%. During the 1960s and 70s, Black women were at the forefront of the civil rights movement. They not only advocated for the end of discriminatory Jim Crow and segregation policies, they also worked to gain access to new work environments, higher wages, and fairer work conditions. During this period, Black women's income growth outpaced all others because of the improved access to education and employment opportunities ushered in by the elimination of discriminatory barriers. These gains were largely due to the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the establishment of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The EEOC allowed Black women to leave domestic service for higher paying jobs such as secretaries, typists, and stenographers, and for Black women with a college education to take managerial jobs. Black women also used these laws to form unions and make changes to their workplaces. However, it is important to contextualize these gains. The incredibly low wages of Black women prior to this time meant this group had the most ground to make up. Post-1960 wage gains have never brought Black women to wage parity with white women, white men, or Black men. The 1960s and 70s also brought the second wave of the women's movement, but the movement largely failed to attract Black women to support an agenda that was designed by privileged white women looking to advance their careers. This movement largely ignored the needs of low-income women of all races, and it failed to promote increased wages, flexibility in work schedules, access to childcare, parental leave, and other benefits that could have changed the economic trajectory of the low-wage women's workforce. Now we will hear a short clip from one of our community reviewers, Dr. Karen Bankston.
This paper brings attention to how the confluence of the civil rights and the women's rights movement had on the impact of Black women, especially during times of economic instability. That perspective is very important to know, especially during today's time, to explain the economic wealth gap.
Thank you, Dr. Bankston. So with the legal reduction of discriminatory practices in the social service programs, the aid to families with dependent children that we mentioned in the New Deal section was finally available to low-income Black families. However, at this time, the perception of welfare changed markedly. Before, women on welfare were noble white mothers working hard to support their children and household. Once the system omitted Black single mothers, the public perception of welfare became negative. In the 1980s, President Reagan coined the phrase welfare queens, which supported the stereotype of a Black woman collecting welfare check because she is too lazy to work. This was despite the fact that Black women with children have always had a proportionally higher labor force participation compared to other mothers. In the 1990s, this negative stereotype led to restrictive requirements in the public assistance system, which still exists today, and the prioritization of many tax credits and anti-poverty initiatives that encouraged a married family structure. These measures often ignore the realities of living in America as a single Black mother and do not offer a pathway out of poverty for many women. This period also saw a rise in single Black female households. In 1960, 22% of Black families were headed by single females, whereas in 1998, the percentage had risen to 47% nationwide. By 2000, 73% of white children and 36% of Black children lived in married couple households. Despite employment advances for Black women in the 1970s, many Black women continued to be overrepresented in service jobs, a trend that remained into the 21st century. The influx of married white women into the labor force led to the commercialization of services they had previously performed within the household, including childcare, health, and food services. And Black women largely transferred into these jobs. These mostly part-time service jobs often have little job security, low wages, and few benefits. Ultimately, white women's occupational success continues to rely on the labor of Black women. Black female entrepreneurs were not new to the US workforce, as previously stated. But by the beginning of the 21st century, Black women were becoming entrepreneurs at a higher rate than ever before. By 2012, the proportion of Black female-owned businesses was at 15.4%, which exceeded the proportion of Black women in the US population for the first time. Indeed, from 2001 to 2012, Black female-owned businesses grew at a faster rate than any other racial or ethnic group. The civil rights movement also created increased opportunities for Black women to attend college and enter professional positions. Still, Black women professionals were more vulnerable than their white counterparts, as many Black women, as many Black women mostly entered the public sector positions to avoid discrimination in the private sector. By the 1990s, 85% of Black female professionals worked in health, social services, education, government, and the nonprofit sectors. Now I will turn it back to our Executive Director, Megan Cummings, to go through section number 2.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Sam, for that overview. The historical analysis is just really interesting. And I think so many times it takes me back to when I took groundwater and phase 1 training through Greater Cincinnati Foundation, where you just learn so much about our history that you haven't been exposed to before. So thanks for that overview. So in section 2, we're going to understand the current economic and occupational mobility of Black women. And this section provides a deeper analysis of the current economic and occupational position of Black women. We're going to talk first about gender and racial pay gaps, which we talk a lot about at the Women's Fund. And then we're going to examine occupational segregation and discriminatory practices that hold back the economic advancement of Black women in our community and across the nation. So first, let's look at some wage gap data. You've seen this from us before. This is more national data. The gender and racial wage gap is well known. The Women's Fund has done many studies on this over the past few years. In fact, the 2028 jobs report we released last year with the Cincinnati USA Regional Chamber, Partners for a Competitive Workforce, and Strive Partnership detailed many of the wage gaps we see in our own community. That report was also the genesis for this deep dive into this project. We knew there has to be something more that is capping these wages, so we wanted to look deeper at it. So let's look at the intersection between race and gender to clarify our understanding of wage gaps and see the documentation of the doubly disadvantaged position of Black women in our current labor force. So comparing the 2017 annual income of full-time year-round workers across the US, Black women earned 87.3% of what Black men earned, 80% of what white women earned, and only 60.8% of what white men earned. Black women's median income was $36,735 a year, as compared to white men at over $60,000 a year, white women at $46,000 a year, and Black men at $42,000 a year. Median hourly wages show the same pattern. In 2015, which was the most recent year for which we could locate this breakdown of data across our nation, white men earned $21 an hour, white women an average of $17 an hour, Black men $15, and Black women $13 an hour. And just to let you know, when you look at an hourly wage like $13 an hour, just kind of double it, and it gives you an idea of what that annual wage would be. So $13 an hour would be about $26,000 a year. These dual gender and race gaps have a huge impact on lifelong earnings for Black women, with an average earnings loss of nearly $1 million over their lifetimes. And of course, this income loss also negatively impacts the ability to generate wealth and to pass down wealth to the next generation. So it's not just about the income gap, but it's also that wealth generation engine as well. And here we can see the median wages by state in our tri-state area. And to put this in perspective, a household consisting of an adult and preschool age child needs to make just under $50,000 a year to cover basic expenses without public assistance in Hamilton County. And you can see, according to this graph, the median wages for Black women is about $33,000 a year. So a huge gap between what they need to be self-sufficient and the wages they are currently earning. So let's talk more about the wage gap. So do you remember that show, Mythbusters? We watched a ton of Mythbusters in our house over the years. So I think we need to bust some common myths about the wage gap today and explore this elusive concept of choice. The wage gap cannot be explained completely by one variable, but we can kind of pull apart the wage gap and look at all of these variables separately. One that comes up very often is the importance of education. We always thought education was the great equalizer, when in fact, female college graduates have experienced a larger widening of the wage gap than other levels of educational attainment. And this is particularly true for Black women. Experience and education are also less relevant to wage gaps today, as women and mothers increase labor force participation and women and Blacks increase college degree attainment. It's just not tied to education the way they thought it would be. The more education for women, the bigger the wage gap compared to their peers. The gender and racial pay gap cannot be explained completely by time taken away to care for families. Although parenthood does exact a wage penalty for women, but not for men. Previously, women worked fewer hours and took more time off for childbearing, a trend that is starting to change. There is a parenthood wage penalty, particularly for women at the bottom of our socioeconomic status. After controlling for job type, union status, education, hours worked, and experience, over 40% of the gender and racial pay gap remains. And more recent estimates put the unexplained portion of the gap at about 2/3. So ultimately, it's clear that demographic factors alone cannot completely explain why gender and race gaps occur. Two additional factors provide important context for understanding differences in wages by gender and race: occupational segregation and discrimination. An estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the pay gap is due to these two factors: occupational segregation and discrimination. So what does occupational segregation mean? That is a mouthful. It's the modern term used to describe the concentration of women and minorities into different occupational fields, even when they have the same levels of education and experience as white men. This segregation has been shaped by gender and racial stereotypes about who is best suited to particular occupations. And both discrimination and tradition have funneled women and minorities into particular occupations over time. The result is an occupational structure that remains segregated along lines of race and gender, despite recent advancement for both women and people of color. Just to be clear, the Women's Fund, we're not advocating for all fields to be gender balanced. We are not envisioning a society where 50% of all plumbers are women or 50% of all childcare workers are men. But we would like to address the fact that when a certain occupation is predominantly women, it just so happens to be paid less. We do not believe that this is a coincidence. So oftentimes you will hear the pay gap explained away that women choose careers that are paid less, and the onus is on them to choose careers that pay better. When in actuality, that career is paid less precisely because it is predominated by women and women of color. This is a big change I've personally had over the years about how we talk about the wage gap and this elusive concept of choice. Although women have increased their proportion in professional jobs, such as doctors, lawyers, managers, from approximately 1/6 to 1/3, most women still work in jobs that are female dominated. And the gender segregation of the labor force has changed little over the past 40 years. This segregation is worse among jobs that require lower levels of education. For example, only 21% of occupations requiring a master's degree are highly segregated by gender, which means 75% of one gender or the other in a given field, versus 74% of jobs requiring a high school or vocational degree alone. Occupational segregation by race and gender has a significant impact on wages. Women tend to be concentrated in firms that paid lower wages to both men and women across all occupations. And conversely, men tend to be employed at the firms that paid higher wages to both sexes. Women, both Black and white, are the majority of workers in the lowest paid occupations like retail, food service, care work. and they're underrepresented in the occupations with the highest wages, those in the financial sector, utilities, information services, insurance, mining, and logging. Let's not forget mining and logging. Even within professional positions, women tend to occupy lower levels of an occupation's hierarchy. For example, women are almost half of managers within professional jobs, but are less than 15% of CEOs. Ultimately, there is no female-dominated profession that, when compared to a male-dominated profession requiring the same education and experiences, is more highly paid. Let me repeat that. There is no female-dominated profession that, when compared to a male-dominated profession requiring the same education and experience, is more highly paid. And I know that before I said we are not advocating for all fields to be gender balanced, but for CEOs and elected officials, well, we think some gender balance in those ranks would be very, very beneficial for all of us. All right, let's talk more about occupational segregation. So Black women are still segregated within the labor force and are overrepresented in lower paying and lower prestige occupations. They are particularly concentrated in low-wage jobs that include childcare, food service, home care aides, nursing assistants, retail cashiers, and domestic work. Note that many of these positions require intensive manual labor. Think of food service, cleaning, adult care work, in contrast to the low-wage positions of white women, which tend to be more clerical and administrative assistants. Ultimately, Black workers are less likely than white workers to be in work positions that carry authority, meaning in supervisory roles, hiring and firing decisions, etc. And this gap cannot be explained by differences in education, family background, or occupation. So clearly, occupational segregation is an important determinant of gender and race wage gaps by concentrating these groups into lower paid occupations. However, it is important to note that within the same occupation and the same job, women and Black workers receive lower pay. This is true even in occupations that are female dominated, for example, administrative assistants, elementary school teachers, and nurses. And it holds true for Black workers across the full range of occupations, including but not limited to construction, financial specialists, healthcare, management, sales, and transportation. Wage gaps that cannot be accounted for by education, experience, hours worked, or occupation segregation are attributed to discrimination, for there's little else left that can explain them. We've teased out all the other variables. So let's talk a little bit about stereotypes. Gender stereotypes play a key role in occupational segregation. For example, the assumptions that women are better at verbally based and caregiving jobs, and men who are better, who are stereotyped into jobs that require mathematical and mechanical reasoning, or that women are less committed to their careers than men because of their family responsibilities. Racial stereotypes are equally insidious, and for Black Americans include assumptions of incompetence and unreliability. Race and gender stereotypes intersect in unique ways for Black women. Black women were historically seen as capable of back-breaking work that traditionally was the realm of only men, which relegated them to farm labor. And then simultaneously, they were seen as fit for the traditional female roles that they had performed on slave plantations and were relegated to domestic service and janitorial duties in the factory. Today, while there are some positive stereotypes of the strength and assertiveness of Black women, most stereotypes continue to be negative, and this is detrimental for how this plays out at work. These negative images depict Black women as loud, domineering, angry, or threatening, leading to this angry Black woman concept. Contrasting stereotypes include the matriarch, who is self-reliant head of the family, and unfortunately, as we talked before, the welfare queen, which was a fabricated story that shows someone that is lazy and unwilling to work. Both stereotypes are damaging to Black women, who are often forced to carry the world on their shoulders. Even seemingly positive stereotypes that demonstrate the perceived strength of Black women can have negative impact on Black women who suffer emotionally and physically from these destructive stereotypes. Black women are also stereotyped as being single mother, which in turn leads to assumptions that they are distracted and likely to be absent due to childcare concerns. Assumptions about motherhood commitments can also result in being offered a lower starting salary. In fact, Black women are less likely than white women to leave their jobs after the birth of a child, and thus the motherhood wage penalty is lower for them. These dynamics are different still for Black women who live in poor neighborhoods, as they are less likely to move to higher wage jobs since they rely on local social networks to assist with caring for their children. And finally, more about discrimination. Racial and gender discrimination have long histories in the United States, as we've seen today, and the roots of systemic pay discrimination and devaluing of the work of Black women can be traced to our horrific past of enslaving them. Stereotyping, implicit bias, and discrimination all influence who gets hired, their salaries, and their promotions in both direct and subtle ways. The attribution of less value of the work traditionally done by women and Black people, particularly care and domestic work. Coming back to this idea of choice, will you choose lower wage occupations? Occupational discrimination against Black people is well documented, and there is extensive evidence of the structural racism that remains in the workforce today. Ultimately, discrimination in our labor market is not just an individual decision to discriminate, but is embedded structurally into our systems and workplace policies. If there is any silver lining to the racial awakening that is going on this summer, I hope it's that we are all realizing the destructive force of discrimination in systems, not just in individuals. A study by Boston University and the Brookings Institution evaluated racial discrimination in the labor market and found that the structure amplifies even modest racist tendencies, yielding highly visible economic outcomes with important social consequences. In other words, even in equilibrium between white and Black workers, firms hired white workers over Black workers, contributing to segregated workplaces and persistent wage discrimination. Research from the National Bureau of Economic Research identified consistent systemic gender discrimination through the gender punishment gap in the financial advisor industry, in which women were more likely to lose their job, 20% more likely, and less likely to find a new one, 30%, than their male advisors. This systemic discrimination is felt doubly by Black women through racist and sexist discrimination, which means it is so important that we always take an intersectional lens to data and policy across our systems to make sure we understand the double impact of sexism and racism together. Now I'd like to hear from one of our community reviewers, Kamara Douglas. She works at City Hall with one of our city council members, and she's done a lot of reviews for the Women's Fund. Let's hear from Kamara.
Hi, my name is Kamara Douglas, and I have the opportunity of being a reviewer. I focus specifically on the stereotype and discrimination component of the research paper, and this was very important to me because we were able to take a look at workplace discrimination, how it affects Black women, and how we're under a microscope. We were also able to look into how Black women don't receive equal pay, as well as the microaggressions and stereotypes that they deal with, and feeling as though they are under a tight microscope at work.
Thank you so much, Kamara. Now let's venture into our final section, section 3 of the actual research we did on this project. And this section is the difficult journey to economic self-sufficiency for Black women. So about the poverty rate, 25% of all Black women live below the poverty line. We are not talking about the self-sufficiency line here. We are talking about the federal poverty line, which is much lower. Of even greater concern is the plight of Black mothers. 8 of 10 are family breadwinners, meaning they provide between 40 and 100% of the family's income. And 39% of Black mothers and their families live in poverty. Because of these high rates of poverty, and we talked about this occupational segregation, 36% of Black Americans receive support from at least one public benefit, compared to 19% of the total US population. Black Americans are disproportionately more likely than their white counterparts to receive public benefits. It wouldn't be a presentation for me if you didn't hear about cliff effect. So let's just do it together. To just sustain a journey to economic security, it is essential to discuss public benefit system in the United States and its structural disincentives, keeping participants in a cycle of poverty. You may have joined us for our cliff effect presentation a few weeks ago, where we went over our newest data about this. Often called the benefit cliff or cliff effect, the public benefit system has structural flaws within it that do not allow participants to gradually work off the system, as a small increase in wages can trigger a complete cutoff of a particular public benefit. This can mean the participant would be worse off financially by taking a raise versus staying at the current wages in order to continue to receive public benefits. This structural flaw negates the primary purpose of the public benefit system, which we think is to support citizens during tough financial times and help people transition out of poverty. As you know, this is one of the top advocacy priorities for the Women's Fund, and Holly will be talking about this more later. I think it's important to mention something right here. When we look at policy now, the explicit bias in our laws has overwhelmingly been removed, thank God. It's not like we can toss all the policy language into Microsoft Word and simply find the instances where it uses the word Black or white to identify policies that overtly call out race. There was a time when this language was explicit. Think about the language around redlining and housing discrimination, or even the voting amendments over the years that gradually included people of color and women. So that explicitness has been removed, but the implicit bias in our policies and practices is alive and well. And I'll give you an example. As previously stated, Black women have a fraught history with public benefits. Initially, they were largely excluded from the Aid to Families with Dependent Children Act portion of the New Deal and other benefit programs. As Sam discussed before, when they were finally able to utilize the systems, the public perceptions were solidified in public policy in the 1990s as federal and state governments changed the assistance structure to utilize work requirements that created barriers to access for those who needed it most. As Sam talked about, when these public benefits first came out, white women used them overwhelmingly, and they were seen as very beneficial. And then when more Black women used it, the tide turned on how these programs were perceived. Black women were already participating in the workforce at a higher rate than white women, so you would think the work requirements wouldn't have an adverse effect on Black women. Well, they did. And why is that? It's because the work requirements largely ignored how Black women participated in the labor force. The types and shifts of jobs that they held didn't meet the new requirements. So this is a place where there is implicit discrimination within our laws without saying Black or white. It's just how different people come to the table. These work requirements did not create a path to gainful employment without public benefits as intended, but instead have increased dependency on programs and widened racial economic disparities. Correcting inequities and disincentives in the public benefit system would reduce poverty and increase economic mobility for Black women. States with higher proportion of Black Americans are more likely to enact policies that make it difficult to utilize benefits. Closing these racial differences in the programs would narrow the Black-white child poverty gap up to 15%. These problematic state policies are more likely to allocate TANF funds toward efforts to encourage the formation of two-parent families and reduce the incidence of out-of-wedlock pregnancies that provide cash support to basic expenses of the poor. It's so important that we recognize and understand where the implicit sexism and racism in our regulations exist. We have to be sophisticated about it to understand where that happens. So now we would like to turn it over to one of our Leadership Council members for the Women's Fund for some commentary about this section, Ms. Barbara Turner.
My journey to self-sufficiency and independence was a difficult one. There were days when I didn't know how I was going to feed my family or whether or not I could pay my rent. Ultimately, others gave me a hand up, and from there I thrived and survived, and here I am now, lifting as I climb.
So, once again, Black women are faced with a crisis that threatens their economic well-being. The COVID-19 pandemic has crippled the US economy, and many Americans have lost their jobs, transitioned to stay at home, and were practicing social distancing. Early in this crisis, it is clear the pandemic will have an inequitable impact on the African American community, and especially Black women. Black women are more likely to hold jobs in identified essential professions of healthcare and food supply, including nursing assistants, cashiers, registered nurses, childcare providers, and personal care aides. During this crisis, Black women are in the difficult situation as their jobs put them at a higher risk of contracting COVID-19, all while working for the lowest wages and scrambling to identify childcare due to center closures. The pandemic and recession have highlighted the deep inequities of these low-wage jobs, many without paid leave and other benefits needed to support their families, even as we hail our essential workers as heroes. Black women are also disproportionately represented in industries hit hardest by COVID-19 pandemic, including restaurants, retail, and hospitality. These occupations are some of the lowest paid in our economy and have critical gaps in workplace protections and supports. Many of these workers have been furloughed or laid off from their jobs and are less likely to have resources to support them and their families during an economic downturn, including savings accounts, assets, and wealth. At the same time, these low-wage jobs have largely been excluded from worker protections in the relief bills. This crisis will exacerbate the challenges for Black women with economic mobility and employment racial disparities noted through this presentation. Without intentional policy support for Black women and other women of color, their recovery from the recession will be at a slower rate than their white counterparts. This research paper, as Megan mentioned, kicks off a series of research on Black women's economic mobility. In the following two phases, the Women's Fund and our research partners have integrated analysis on the COVID-19 impact on Black women in our region and will help develop policy recommendations that center Black women in our recovery. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our advocacy director, Holly Hankinson, who will walk us through the last section.
Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon. As explored in this report, race and gender disparities in our employment system have long hindered Black women's economic success. After centuries of oppression and discrimination, we need many bold and sustained policy actions to create a pathway to equity and mobility for Black women in the US. As we conclude, we will outline a number of policy initiatives grouped into 4 overarching categories. We also refer you to other research reports created by the Women's Fund, as well as the resources cited in this report. Next slide, thanks. Creating or strengthening employment-centered policies is critical to supporting occupations where Black women are disproportionately represented. First, we should modernize our employment policies to ensure equity and support low-wage workers. Many initiatives are in this category, including pay transparency, salary history bans, benefits for part-time workers, and paid family leave. Low-wage workers also benefit from predictable and flexible scheduling, payment for shift cancellation, and transportation support. Domestic service workers have been left out of protections available to workers in other industries. These workers include employees of private households that perform tasks such as house cleaning, cooking, childcare, gardening, and personal service. We should eliminate policies exempting these workers from unemployment insurance and workers' compensation, and policies prohibiting them from unionizing. Federal policymakers should also consider passing a National Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. Collective bargaining has long been a route to pay equity and improving benefits across a wide variety of occupations, and may be a particularly important vehicle for low-wage workers. Finally, we must strengthen our enforcement of anti-discrimination policies and implement diversity and inclusivity training to promote better cultural practices for Black women. There needs to be additional work to ensure solutions are equitable and not just checking off the box for employers. The next set of policy recommendations addresses changes to the various government assistance programs relied upon by many low-wage workers. First, we must reform the public benefit system to ameliorate the cliff effect, as Megan discussed earlier. Rather than supporting a smooth path to self-sufficiency, our current benefit system contains barriers that create disincentives to wage advancements. Addressing these disincentives will provide a pathway out of poverty, supported by a social safety net that would remain until recipients can support themselves and their families on their incomes alone. We must also recognize and prioritize childcare as essential infrastructure in our economy. In order for working parents to function properly in our employment market, they need safe, affordable childcare for their children. Governments should prioritize this community need as they do other publicly funded infrastructure. Proposed ideas include universal pre-K, expanding provider reimbursement rates, and incentivizing employers to establish pre-tax childcare accounts or invest in on-site providers. Governments should also invest in pilot programs and projects focused on closing pay equity gaps, supporting Black women's economic mobility, and reforming the benefit systems, such as Colorado's 2014 pilot project to ameliorate the cliff effect. Education and training policies can also be used to reduce inequities and close occupational gaps. Policymakers and workforce development programs should develop strategies and goals, including funding increases, aimed at promoting gender and racial equity in training programs for higher wage career paths and in traditionally male-dominated fields. We must also consider education reform. Our public schools remain deeply segregated, and significant funding inequities result in a lack of resources available to many predominantly Black public school districts. Policymakers should strongly consider K-12 education reforms, including addressing inequities in school quality, reforming education finance, including finding alternatives to funding based on property tax, and promoting school choice. At the collegiate level, tuition assistance for Black women is critical, as they typically graduate with higher student loan debt and matriculate into careers that pay less. Increasing funding for Pell Grants and student loan debt assistance should also be considered. Finally, policies addressing wages and wealth can be incredibly effective because they most directly impact economic mobility and wealth accumulation. Evidence is beginning to mount that states and localities with increased minimum wage have seen higher wage growth at the bottom of the scale than areas without minimum wage increases. Raising the minimum wage will move us toward a living wage that allows many working poor families to achieve economic self-sufficiency. It is also particularly important for Black women who are disproportionately in minimum and tipped wage jobs. Evidence and data transparency is critical. Governments and employers should be required to publish data on hiring, promotions, pay, and benefits, and we should expand collection of intersectional data on key indicators of economic mobility. Black people have been systemically excluded from access to capital and investing that would have helped them grow their business and wealth. Policies should be enacted to expand capital resources to the Black community and establish procurement and contracting opportunities for Black-owned businesses. Finally, policymakers should research and consider implementing a reparations program to address our long history of slavery, systemic racism, and oppression. While there is no settled definition of reparations in the US, it can include truth-telling and the official acknowledgement of the atrocities of slavery and systemic racism. as well as a significant financial investment to address their consequences. Several approaches have been raised by thought leaders in the field, including deep investments in social services, education and training programs focused on racial justice, as well as baby bonds, among others. The idea of reparations has been gaining traction over the past number of years and should be given meaningful consideration in state and federal policy discussions. Each policy suggested above is an important step, but none in isolation is sufficient to eliminate racial and gender disparities. Governments, employers, and communities must apply a gender and racial lens to data and policies across the entire system. Governments and employers should create infrastructures to support racial and gender equity by establishing equity departments, conducting equity audits of budgets and programs, and examining the race and gender impact of each new policy or piece of legislation. Many resources are available to support this work. Leadership also matters. We must prioritize increasing the number of Black women in decision-making roles in both governments and companies. This can be achieved through intentional recruitment, training, and funding of Black women candidates, as well as prioritizing mentorships and increasing the pipeline of Black women leaders within organizations. By embedding equity in our institutions and lifting up more diverse leaders, we can take an important step to reduce barriers to economic mobility for Black women across our communities. So now I'm going to send it back over to Megan Cummings as we take questions on any of the research or recommendations you've heard here today.
Thanks, Holly. So I have to answer any question that comes in right now. Is that right?
That's right. They're all for you.
So we have the message and the Q&A open. So if you have a question on any of these sections, we'll be happy to do that. I'll be happy to take it if I know the answer, and if it's more appropriate to Sam or Holly, I am going to throw it right to them so easily. We have a first question from Carol Fensel. Hi, Carol. Thanks for joining us today. And she's asking, what is a baby bond? Holly, actually, I do think this is a question for you.
Sure, absolutely. I can give a brief overview, and then actually there's a link in the report to Derek Hamilton's great work on this. So a baby bond is a really interesting concept that was created by Derek Hamilton, who's an Ohio State professor. And it's the idea that the government would provide seed and account for every child born in the United States, that every child has access, and it's based on family wealth would be the amount of money that's in that account. And then over the course of the child's childhood, they would receive every year another amount of money in that account, again, based on the wealth of the family. And then when the child is an adult, that would be accessible for a few limited reasons. So education, I believe purchasing a home or starting a business. And so the idea behind this is because of the wealth gap, the historic wealth gap, and historic disparities that have occurred for, in the Black community and for Black families across in history, this would provide a way for Black Americans to have wealth that they were prohibited from having when all the wealth has gone to white families in the course of our history. So, but it's interesting because the policy doesn't directly provide any money based on race. It is based on wealth, which is just sort of an interesting concept. It's gotten a hearing at Congress earlier this year. So I know it's just one of the policies that is being considered at the federal level. So I encourage you to read more about it. It's really interesting.
Thanks, Holly, so much. Mia is asking, will this recording be available for others to view if they were not able to attend today? Absolutely. We will send out the link and encourage you to share it broadly. The more people learning this information with us is great. Jay, hey Jay, thanks for joining us today. He's asking, the initiatives we're doing as a fund, are we coordinating closely with other women's funds across the country and learning best practices? Actually, absolutely, yes. So the Women's Fund of the Greater Cincinnati Foundation belongs to a network called the Women's Funding Network. There's probably about 70 or 80 women's funds from across North America in this organization. The CEOs and executive directors have been meeting every single Friday, especially since COVID hit, to exchange best practices, align our advocacy agendas, et cetera. Although women's funds tend to be, they have a very big spectrum of what they work on. Some are just grant making organizations, some do research, advocacy. If you've seen one, you've kind of seen one. And many of them have very specific areas of focus, but we're working together to see, you know, all the funds that are working on economic mobility have a really aligned their agenda and learning from each other. It's a very collaborative community and one we're happy to be a part of. So they are a great partner to the Women's Fund, and it's all coordinated. At the state level, we also work with a lot of other coalitions. There's a Women's Fund in Columbus that we work closely with. We're also partners with the Ohio Public Policy Network and Groundwork Ohio, which works on childcare issues. So where we can build or participate in coalitions, that absolutely happens. All right. Anne Schwister, thanks for joining us today. And her question, thanks for the positive comments. And will you be joining this session again so we can refer others? The report will be published on our site. I think it's actually up now, and this recording will be available to share. And also with all of our research, we are happy to do this presentation to other groups in the community. Basically, when we release research, we want it to breathe out in the community and with organizations. So we're happy to schedule any other presentations of this information. Just reach out to us personally and we'll make sure that happens. All right, a lot of other people just commenting on other policies and practices. They're learning a lot about history and facts today. Let's see. Trina Madry has a question. Any perspective on how continued advances for women, which have tended to have greater impact for white women, may be amended in a way to also benefit Black women? Sam or Holly, do either one of you want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think what we saw as we looked at the history, especially as you look at the second wave of feminism, is that the agenda was set for mostly white women and mostly by white women. And that is something that I think as we move forward, it's about centering Black women and centering the experiences of women of color as we develop what policies and practices may have the biggest and best influence on the barriers that are met. So having a diverse table and making sure that we're being conscious of the perspectives of all.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Sam. That's really important. And, you know, especially we've had a lot of really deep conversations this summer about the new economic recession that COVID has given us, and really learning lessons from the 2008 recession about how Black women recovered much more slowly, if at all, from that recession as compared to their counterparts. So we need to learn some good lessons from 2008 and apply them to the current economic crisis triggered by COVID. So I agree with Sam. We have to center Black women's needs in everything we do. Allison Tepper had a great question. What can be done to educate the public about our wage structure that pays low wages for roles such as home health care, where many Black women work? This is a huge policy concern for us. We've been in talks with other ways we can change the reimbursement rates for some of these jobs. So they would get a bump in pay just by the reimbursement rates being changed. This has happened in New York, I believe, and we have some research about that, how that automatically bumped those wages when those reimbursement rates were looked at. So we have some plans to see if we can do that in Ohio and Kentucky as well. Giovanna Alvarez. Hey, Giovanna, thanks for joining us today. She says it's a great presentation and this data validates what we all know. It's important to highlight all the discriminatory practices against Black women. And she's asking about future studies that will include Hispanic and Latina women. Really great. And we talk about this all the time in our office. One very real limitation we have with especially our quantitative data in our MSA is the Latino population is about 3% of our local MSA, which means we can't get a statistically significant cut on a lot of our data, especially around the wage gap and other things locally. When we look at nationwide, we can get a lot more data, but just in our area, it's really hard to get the sample size we need for this data of Latino community. So it's something that's always on our mind, and we're really in tune with this as we bring community voice to the table, as we bring leadership into the Women's Fund to make sure we're representing the needs of that community as well. It's very important. And as we know, every community has, different needs and different things that are important to them and different barriers they're facing. So it's important to consider the needs of the Latino community as well and Latina community. So thank you, Giovanni, for that question, and more to come on that. It's always top of mind for us. Lisa Fitzgibbon, this is our board chair. Hi, Lisa. To help us best communicate the importance of this research to others, especially policymakers, what do you think this report adds or clarifies that wasn't generally known before? Great question. And Holly, I think this one is probably in your ballpark.
Sure. I think that's a great question. I think there's a lot in this report that maybe bits and pieces of it were known by different sort of policymakers and leaders. I think what this report does that's so compelling is that it takes all of these pieces of information and facts and all of our history and pulls it all together in a way that ties this whole system of oppression and the ways that Black women have been devalued and excluded from our labor markets, and it puts that all in one place. And I think that's really important. Policymakers and other leaders in other fields are usually very, very busy, and they don't have time to go in deep on every single research report and get a big education, sort of historical context of the issues that they're facing. And so I think by pulling this together, all this in one place, it makes a really compelling case for policy change that we haven't seen before, which is why we did it. And I think it makes it really clear that all these issues and the history is connected to what's happening right now.
Yeah, great. I agree, Holly. And as I said many times in the presentation, this idea of choice, that women are choosing to work in low wage professions, and we really have to switch that narrative. And I think that's one of the things this research report does. It shows that this is not just a choice of to go into a certain occupation you may want to work in and accept those low wages. It's really showing the historical context of why the wages are low in certain occupational sectors, precisely because the people that are constituting those. So I think that's the big sea change for me on this report. Thanks for all your wonderful questions. So we'd like to move on to what's next. After you have, new information at your fingertips, what can we do with that? So here's what's next. First of all, read the full paper at cincinnatiwomensfund.org. It's available right now. It is a very sobering read, of course, but it's very important. And I think we've laid it out in a way that's very engaging. So read that full paper there. The Greater Cincinnati Foundation, we are a proud member of the GCF family. They have been doing some terrific trainings across the community through Racial Equity Matters. A lot of you have probably heard the names Groundwater Training and Phase 1 Training. They have been offering these trainings across our community. Most of the ones in 2020 are sold out, which is a great thing. That means there's a lot of interest in those trainings in our community. But please be on the lookout for that 2021 schedule. If you were interested in learning this history with us today, those trainings that GCF is offering really round out that understanding about race in our country. The third thing is engage with the stories from women in our community. We have just completed this wonderful partnership with Women of Cincy, and they have profiled 6 women in our community that are living these issues each day. And their stories are just show this beautiful fabric of their families and their jobs and how systems level issues end up playing very intimately in our lives every day. So please read those. It brings a much more personal perspective to a lot of the issues we've talked today. You can read all these stories through our social media accounts or at womenofcincy.org/economic mobility. And thank you so much to Women of Cincy for doing that series with us. You were terrific partners. And finally, share this research paper with your book club or your group of friends. We've seen so many people dive into race-related topics this summer and going into this fall. I think if you looked at that New York Times bestseller list, in June or July, there was a new appetite for this kind of information. So why not, for your next book club, actually take this paper and discuss it together? We've put together a discussion guide on our website to kind of spur dialogue and spur that conversation with the groups of your friends or book clubs. So why not take an opportunity to actually learn together and talk with your friends, talk with your peer groups about what you're hearing. Give this to a coworker. See how you can be part of making sure we don't continue this same history of discrimination. I know today was a lot, and I'd like to end the way we began today, which is visiting with our friend Maya Bird, and she's going to kind of close us out this afternoon.
Hi, thank you, Megan. So I know that was a lot of information to go through, and I'm so glad that all of you were able to be with us today and learn some new things. And I hope that you guys take the time to look at that report in detail. I was able to do that. So I wanted us to end on more of a hopeful note. You know, history can be full of things that make us sad or angry or confused. And this report is no different. We went from the very beginnings of our country to present time, and we're seeing a lot of injustice in that. But I want us to remember that changes have been made. There's been growth and progress over time and over the years that we've seen. And there's still growth and progress to be made, and that will be made, especially with the policy actions and the day-to-day actions that we've been able to look at and to take. So a few of the day-to-day actions that I'd like to suggest is, yes, read the Women of Cincy articles. They are amazing. And I have a few friends who are interviewed for it. Another day-to-day action is just to talk to the Black women in your life and to start a conversation. Ask them how they're doing, figure out how you can be helpful just in the workplace or in day-to-day relationships. And then also remember the hope that we're going forward with. So one story that I'd like to share is that the state of Mississippi in July, after 126 years, has removed the Confederate flag from its state flag. And it was the state that refused for the longest to remove that. And in the year 2020, they finally said, this history is not what we want to be remembered for. And this is not the history that we want to honor. And so there is change and progress, slowly but surely being made even this year. And I'd like us to remember that. Some of the self-care suggestions that I would like to share. There are multiple breathing, grounding exercises like the ones that I led you through at the beginning that you can look at. There's also quite a few self-care things that you can do for yourself. So if you are, like me, a Black woman who has read this report or heard this report or lived through some of this report, take time to actually take care of yourself and be able to actually sit down and breathe and be able to remember hope and joy. Like I said before in the beginning, emotions are all messengers, no matter what they are, whether it's anger or fear or joy. They all let us know something important. So I hope that you guys have a wonderful week and that you guys are able to take the lessons you've learned today and apply them in your lives.
Thank you so much, Maya. Thanks for being with us today. And thanks for all of you for attending. And let's keep the conversation going. Please visit our website for the follow-up from today and look for an email with the link to the recording so you can share it with others in your life. Thanks again. We're so honored to be in this fight with you, and onward. Have a good afternoon. Thanks.